Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Awesome. Okay. So let me start. Yeah. Can you listen? Can you hear me? Mhm. Yeah, sure. Let me. Um, um, awesome. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Anish. Oh, awesome. I hope I'm audible to everyone. So, hey everyone, I'm Saik Sarkar, and it's great to be here. I'm sorry I could not be there in person, but yeah. So today I'll be talking to you about leading and growing an open source community. And so to start things off, I wanted to talk about what open source is and what does community leadership mean. So as contributors to a project become more familiar with how the project works, they may wish to become more active in helping the project grow. Ultimately, this means that they will be taking on more responsibilities within the project. So today we are going to discuss in more detail this means, what it means, that is to lead an open source community or project, and the fact that contributing to an open source project and leading that project are two different modes of engaging with that project. Uh, so as an contributor to an open source software project, your duties to the project may more or less be straightforward. You fix bugs, answer questions in the project's communication channels, and do more. So, when assuming the position of leadership in the project, your role becomes even more comprehensive. You may drive technical direction, begin speaking with authority for the project in public venues like uh, conferences, initiate programs to recruit new project members, or change projects, processes, and policies. Increase responsibility for success or the project's failure. So why do we want to do that? Why do we want to take responsibility for a project and the community success? So there are many reasons to take on a leadership position in your favorite open source project, ranging from the needs of your employer to your own personal joy. And as you consider taking on a leadership position in the project, uh, you need to take some time to think through your motivations for doing that. So having a good understanding of why you want to lead will eventually help you to choose the best places for you to apply your skills and interests in that project. So it might be in terms of conflict resolution or better triaging uh, issues, and or it might also be to make sure that the users are getting help more quickly. Now, it's no secret that leading an open source project has many tangible benefits when it comes to uh, seeking employment, but many individuals choose leadership position for a very simple reason that they just appreciate the social connections that they make in within the project's community, and after a while, they want to be of greater service to other folks who might be in that community, right? So in this during the course of this session, we will explore leadership in open source projects, the responsibilities leaders have, the transition pathway from being a contributor to a leader, and some ways in which excellent leaders help their projects avoid common social changes. So our goals for today is more in terms of understanding common challenges which are associated with expanding, maintaining, and popularizing an open source project. And the next goal would be to explore steps new community leaders can take to begin addressing those challenges. And finally, identify steps that leaders can take to achieve project success. Uh, so one additional note, I can't guarantee that you will leave together, like we will leave today with like everyone equipped with everything you could possibly need to know about being a project leader or a community leader. Every project is different, and I don't know every bit of advice that can help you lead each of these different communities. And you will need to basically translate this advice into your own context. So what we are going to do today is we are going to examine the most common avenues for meeting the challenges new leaders face, and general pathways for getting started, and by using the things that we learn, which we find to be the most fruitful, right? So let's begin by stressing that anyone interested in assuming a leadership role in a community-driven project will need to begin asking three fundamental questions about that project. And these questions are how you can expand the project, add contributors, and increase participation in the project, maintain the project, ensure that your growth is sustainable and that the project stays on course in the pursuit of its mission and vision, and popularize the project. How do you popularize the project? Increase its visibility, make it an appealing destination for users and contributors, and keep it relevant in an ever-growing ecosystem, right? So the remainder of our session today will focus on each of these three questions. Uh, so going forward, let's begin with the challenge of expanding the community, increasing community participation and contribution. So what are the common challenges? Some of the common challenges, most common challenges that come up in communities are challenges around undocumented or insider information or folk wisdom. Excessive and undocumented insider information usually makes newcomers feel like they lack context, and usually that makes them feel excluded. Then there's the challenge of unwelcome social dynamics. How welcome do your contributors feel? Perhaps the project is not as inclusive as it could be. Then there is the challenge of undifferentiated contributor base. Communities lacking a diverse contributor base may not seem welcoming to newcomers, especially those from underrepresented groups. We mean diversity along all types of access over here. So it might be the types of skill sets that they have, a vendor diversity, number of industries represented, gender diversity, racial diversity, geographic diversity, and the list goes on. So when working to grow your community, if it appears that the community is only comprised of one type of contributor, people who are not existing, who are not like the people who already exist in the community, the existing contributor base, may not feel very comfortable joining that community. Then finally, the biggest or the most common challenge that folks face is the challenge of language barriers. So communities that communicate in only one language, mostly English is the most common language that is found. These communities can be intimidating for those who don't speak that language. Now, going forward, what are the technical challenges in this regard, right? So lack of clear onboarding documentation on ways to get started can deter newcomers. Aligning contributors with project needs uh, is one of the most common problems that leaders face. So aligning contributors with different skills to the most appropriate domains inside the project can be really, really challenging. And then finding additional contributors with specific domain knowledge of very specialized use cases can be very difficult, especially when it comes to very niche code bases. And speaking of code bases, the project might be relatively niche, right? So locating additional contributors who share its typical use case is usually a bit more difficult. So let's talk about contributor pathways, right? So every project and community will need to address these challenges in different ways that are the most effective for them. However, in general, we suggest beginning to address these challenges by examining your own uh, community's contributor pathways. So, um, okay, I think we're back. So I hope I didn't skip anything. So yeah, let's continue. So yeah, we were talking about contributor pathways, right? So opportunities for volunteers to begin lending their unique talents to an open source project are usually what's called the project's contributor pathways. And the greater the number of contributors pathways your project features, the more likely it is to recruit participants with various skills required for the project's success. So when you're thinking of ways to expand your project, focusing on contributor pathways is a great place to begin. And yeah, so what are the typical contributor pathways, right? So let's take a look at these. First, here are some pathways with a community focus, documenting software and processes, onboarding and mentoring new members, localizing content into various languages, copywriting, managing social media, organizing events. You might want to ask, does your project currently offer new and existing contributors opportunities to contribute rewardingly or even take ownership of in each of these pathways? The next thing is things with the more technical the project pathways, contributor pathways with technical focus. So adding new features and documentation, fixing existing bugs and pricing issues, refactoring existing work to improve it, performing quality assurance, improving user interface and UI UX in general, release engineering, creating and maintaining project roadmap, core and user interface localization. So these are some of the most common contributor pathways with a more technical focus. So you might want to ask yourself again, does your project currently offer new and existing contributors opportunity to contribute rewardingly to or even take ownership of work in each of these pathways? If not, one general way to begin expanding your project is by making a concerted effort to formalize, refine, and document and advertise these contributor pathways. So I hope I'm audible. I was not sure if. Okay, so okay, okay, yeah, thank you. So okay, let's continue with uh, exploring the challenges associated with maintaining a project, sustaining its growth as our prior expansion efforts succeed, and look at the common challenges with maintenance, right? So additional infrastructure and overhead is one of the most, I think, common things again. So adding additional tooling and infrastructure creates additional work of coordinating participants. Time spent otherwise might be used for enhancing project work. For smaller leaders, may have to take on responsibilities for deploying and maintaining these new systems in addition to coordinating volunteer work. Other than this, preserving community intimacy is a big challenge. So preserving the intimacy that makes the community so appealing requires much more care as the community keeps expanding. So fewer people may really know one another, but what that results in is that the social bonds tend to weaken as the community keeps growing. Uh, the next challenge is keeping a growing number of participants informed. So keeping all participants informed about project development requires more time and effort if that community is large. So managing competing visions for the project as a community grows, competing visions for the project might create contributor tension. Architecting and scaling the project's mission and vision. So as projects begin as personal hobbies, they don't always have very explicit, clearly defined community mission and vision statements. And without these, the projects usually don't scale well. So uh, I think one of the biggest problems here is when projects start, when communities start in the initial stages, a lot of the community leaders don't really have that mindset, or they don't probably imagine the common challenges that they might face in the future, and this is what results in much of these projects coming up. So hence I'm trying to highlight these points over here. Now, moving forward, let's talk about governance models. So every project and community will need to address these challenges in ways that are most effective for them. However, in general, we suggest beginning to address these challenges by examining your project's governance models, right? So the specific combination of rules and customs that define who gets to do what and how they're supposed to do it is called a project's governance model. And the better you understand a project's governance model, the greater are your chances of successfully helping that project evolve. So as you look at ways to help sustain the project's growth and success, it's highly recommended that you begin by examining your project's governance models, right? So every project has a governance model, even the ones that say that they don't. So you might want to begin by pinning down specific details of the way the project is running today. Now, here is a way of just 6 types of open source governance models. We don't really have much time to explore the individual models. However, it may suffice to say that knowing your project is running and who is making decisions is a perfect way to think about to actually start thinking about making the project more sustainable. Now, if the project relies on too few people, if the decisions aren't being made in the most effective ways, then you might want to begin by addressing these issues first. So yeah. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is dimensions of governance. Fundamentally, however, you will need to begin thinking about the various roles people play in the community and the various policies and procedures that govern and direct people in those roles. Now, roles are specific functions that contributors perform in and for the project. Now, roles have rights and responsibilities and expectations associated with them. So you might want to make sure that these are explicitly documented. And the next thing is policies and procedures. Now, policies and procedures are the specific rules and processes that direct people in particular roles and define the limit of acceptable behavior for these projects. It's best to uh, identify these its best practices and so on. So you need to make sure that these are also explicitly documented. So simply documenting roles, policies, and procedures can go a long way towards helping your project become way more sustainable in the long run. So next, and let's move on to popularizing the project, how we can do that. So increasing a project's visibility while making it an appealing destination for users and contributors and keeping it relevant in an ever-growing ecosystem is key to popularizing a project. So what are the key challenges, right? So some of the key challenges for popularizing a project include increased competition for contributors' time, attention, and energy. So competing for contributors' time, attention, and energy is usually more difficult than ever, as the number of open source projects keeps on increasing globally. Then community materials are available in limited number of languages. So projects become popular when they connect with diverse groups of people. But often project materials are only available in a limited number of languages. Now, if your community is not communicating in English, many people may not even be aware that it exists, right? So you might want to take a look at this. And then the next thing is the ever-growing threat of maintainer burnout. Now, this is a very, very big challenge. So as the project becomes more and more popular, maintainers might experience burnout while they're trying to keep pace with it. The next point is around mismatched expectations between enterprise users and hobbyists. So many popular open source projects are relied upon by large enterprises, but they're maintained by volunteers, leading to a mismatch of expectations between users who may be expecting enterprise support and developer hobbyists who are working in their spare time. So when people are using the project for enterprise work, but the software is maintained by hobbyists, there can be an expectations mismatch that leads to friction in the community. The last point is around proliferation of platforms for user engagement, and finding the best way, to reach your potential users and contributors can be time consuming, given that many users, so given that there are many ways by which people choose to consume information, uh, and how the users expect to hear about things online, probably on places like Reddit and on Facebook and Twitter. Uh, so figuring out where to meet people when where they are, I mean, and also trying to figure out, are you there or not, is kind of difficult, and it might be overwhelming for project leaders at times. So as with other challenges we addressed so far, we could discuss many other ways, to begin addressing popularization challenges. But in general, we have found that focusing on a project's reward models is a great place to begin. So let's talk a bit about reward models. So strategies for acknowledging and honoring various contributions to an open source project are called the project's reward models. The more reward models your project constructs, the better it can engage with participants in different motivations for contributing, right? For example, here are the four most common models. Spotlighting community contributors, swag, a big chunk of community contributors love swag. So meet the community features, community awards, and each of these models aims to connect with a certain set of motivations that participants may have for contributing to a project. Now, everyone contributes to a project for a reason, and the most popular projects are those that make contributors feel rewarded, right, valued, their and the contributors feel respected in those communities, right? So generating those feelings in contributors is a great way to build your project's reputation as a rewarding and welcoming place. So let's unpack this a bit more. Spotlighting community contributions using point systems, badges, and leaderboards to chart and publicly identify contributions, usually rewarding participants by visualizing the magnitude of their contributions, right? So this is a great option for connecting with people who tend to value opportunities to show off their technical prowess a bit more. Then things like meet contributors, wherein you can be running blog posts or video series to spotlight contributors, reward participants by helping them to grow their network, grow their personal brands, and also to grow them to also by helping them to grow their professional networks, right? So this is a great option for connecting with people who see community participation as an opportunity to gain visibility, maybe even find future or employment opportunities, right? Swag. This is the biggest one, probably. Giving contributors various items signifying their affiliation with the community, things like shirts, hats, keychains, etc. These allow participants to feel a sense of connection with the project. This is a great option for connecting with people who see community participation as central to their identities and as a fundamental part of their identity building work, right? So it basically allows them to show off their connections with the community when interacting with others, and also makes membership in that community part of their identities. And then again, we have community awards, like allowing the community members to recognize and reward others among them helps communities to develop shared identities and social bonds. So we are almost out of time, but let me try to take a moment to review what might be coming next for you. Gathering community feedback and measuring your success is a really critical component. And since I don't have much time, let me try to go through it really, really fast. So, leading an open project means making yourself more available to address community ideas and concerns and more. So your feedback is critical to your success, and you're positioning yourself as the party that is most likely to act on community feedback. So you need to continually collect it. And here are some of the four most common methods. You can have open feedback forms, you can do fireside chats, community calls, and community Q&A. Again, I don't think I need to explain this much, so let's move on. Uh, and you will need to then be able to measure the success of the work with the community, and depending on your situation, this could be important for two reasons. Communicating success with the community, how will you narrate your community's success in achieving its mission and objectives, and you will need to be able to help your community measure its progress, chart its accomplishments, and stay focused on achievements, right? How will you do that? And the next one is communicating success with organizational stakeholders. How will you explain the value of working with your community to others in your organization? If you're leading a community because of a project is integral to your organization, then you will need to be able to explain to the value of your work internally too, right? To the organization's stakeholders. And here are just a few more potential metrics you might want to take a look at pertaining to technical contributions. And so, and also here are a few more potential metrics you might want to track pertaining to non-technical contributions, right? So once you determine how you're going to begin addressing leadership challenges, these will be your next steps. So in summary, I think I can just go through this really quickly. People choose to lead open source projects for various reasons, including organizational need, a sense of responsibility to the community, and or personal or professional fulfillment, right? By choosing to lead an open source project or community, you assume increased responsibility for that project's success or failure. New community leaders face challenges related to expanding, maintaining, and popularizing their projects. They can begin to address these challenges by examining their project's contributor pathways, governance models, and reward models. And they will also need to determine the best ways to gather feedback from their communities and to communicate the value and success of their work to various stakeholders, right? So, yeah, that was it from me. Thank you. And I'm sorry if I went a little too fast at the end. I just, we were a bit hard on time. So thank you for listening to me. And if anyone has any questions, I can take them. Yeah. So I have uh, I have not heard about the book. To be frank, um, I don't have book recommendations as much as I would probably uh, suggest going through some of the literature that's already available online. So I think there are a few people from the initial days of the internet that you might want to look up. You might want to look up at the stories of some of the most popular open source communities and how they work. For example, there is the Fedora community is there, the Mozilla community is there, and you know, if you look at the genesis of any of these projects, you will find that there are a lot of leaders, and you might want to. I don't want to specify anyone's name right away, but I would strongly suggest like going through how those leaders actually started those projects and how they went about it. It's very openly documented. Um, so a quick search on the internet can really help you with it. I'm not a big fan of suggesting books for leadership, for understanding leadership in open source. I am a strong believer in experience based uh, understanding. So if you are not already participating, I think you already are. But if you uh, like try getting into open source communities, read about the genesis of each of the communities, and you will get to learn a lot more. Uh, does that answer your question? Mhm. Excellent question, actually. Um, this. Eh, I just have a counter question to that before I answer that. Are you asking about you as an individual who has a certain disability, how you can do it, or are you talking about how can we increase participation in general? Okay, okay, yeah, yeah. I'm already on Discord. Okay, yeah. Thank you, everyone. It was great being here.
Can you hear me? Is this okay? Hello? Can you hear me?
Mine's on. I don't know about yours.
No, it doesn't sound like it's on.
It's on a little bit.
Hello? Okay.
Did he say it was on?
Yeah.
Where?
Okay. Try this one. Is this better? Oh, it's pretty loud now. All right. Welcome to our talk. Today's talk is what's new and what's next at Fedora CoreOS. Michael Nguyen, and this is Dusty Mabe. So today's agenda, we're going to talk about what is Fedora CoreOS, what happened last year, what's new since last year, and what's coming soon. So we'll start with, we'll take questions at the end. So please hold them until we're finished with the presentation. So what is Fedora CoreOS? It's an emerging Fedora edition. It came from the merging of like two communities, CoreOS Inc.'s Container Linux and Project Atomic's Atomic Host. And what we did was we basically picked what we liked from each project. From Container Linux, we took the philosophy, the provisioning stack, and the cloud native expertise. And from Atomic, and this mostly revolves around a tool called Ignition. We'll talk about it a little bit later. From Atomic Host, we took the Fedora Foundation, the update stack using RPM OSTree and OSTree, and enhanced security with SE Linux, which Container Linux did not have. So the philosophy behind Fedora CoreOS. One of the biggest features is automated provisioning. All nodes basically start from the same point. We use the same, essentially the same disk image for whatever platform you're using. We only bake in like specific platform IDs into the image, but essentially it's the same disk image. And the way we change that image or mutate that image is basically using this tool called Ignition. And that basically takes a configuration file called an ignition config. And on first boot, we'll lay down files, start systemd units, and whatever you need to make it what you want. The second feature is immutable infrastructure. We want you to automate the deployment and the system configuration. And instead of like logging in and SSHing in and making changes to the file system and stuff yourself, we actually want you to do that through configs, like the Ignition config. And the idea here is that if you have changes to a system, you can just reprovision it with the changes from your Ignition config, and you could have that stored in like a Git or something like that, if it's cheap enough to do so. Another philosophy behind is we actually want the software that you run on Fedora CoreOS to be run in containers. We need this clean separation between what you're running and what the host OS is in order to make host updates more reliable. And one of the biggest features we have is automatic updates. So automatic updates are actually enabled by default. There's no interaction required from the administrator. So if there's new bug fixes or CVEs, you get them by default. And obviously, we don't want you to turn off automatic updates. So the biggest things that we don't want you to do is actually to disable it. So if we don't want you to disable it, we have to make sure that the updates are rock solid. And none of that happens without a lot of CI tests passing. Everything has to pass our CI tests. Every build that we do has to pass all these tests. So we make sure that the updates are rock solid. Another way to help with the stability of the systems is we actually have 3 testing streams in Fedora CoreOS. We have the next stream that can include the next major version of Fedora or some new early access to new features. And testing and stable are pretty tied together. So testing is basically a snapshot of what will be in stable in about 2 weeks. We try to release a stable release every 2 weeks. So how you would have this set up in your setup would be you would have like a whole bunch of stable systems, a whole bunch of systems running Fedora CoreOS on the stable stream, and maybe like 1 or 2 that are running and testing. And if there are any issues, if anything goes wrong in the testing one, you know that the change will come down in 2 weeks. So if you find any issues there, like you can file an issue with Fedora CoreOS, and then we'll just like take a look at it and see if we can fix it before it actually makes its way down to stable and affect other users. Fedora CoreOS is actually supported on a whole bunch of different platforms. We have like over 10 listed here, and the Fedora CoreOS is directly launchable on AWS and GCP. We also have options for bare metal. We have a live ISO installer. You can run it in RAM, or you can just boot in, and then you can start your installation from that live ISO. We also have a Pixie boot, and also have RAW and 4K native images. We also have support for multiple architectures, x86, ARch, and S390x, and we have PPC64LE coming down the pipeline. So what happened last year in Fedora CoreOS? We switched to cgroups v2 by default. We did this a little bit later than than regular Fedora. That was because some of the container software wasn't ready for it, most notably Kubernetes. So that switch was made in, I forget what version it was, 34? Yeah. Early last year. We have another feature is more reliable live changes to the system, because RPM OS tree and OS tree, Fedora CoreOS is mostly immutable. We now have new options to change the content live in a safe and atomic way. We basically, this command used to be experimental, but now it's fully supported. It's RPM OS tree install live apply. So if you've ever used any RPM OS tree based system before, whenever you made changes, you have to reboot basically. And with this, you can install a package and just have it automatically switch into the deployment without a reboot, which is really nice. Another feature that was added in Ignition was support for adding, removing, and replacing kernel arguments. This is applied on first boot and will trigger a reboot. So essentially, like if any of you used AWS for a while, they didn't have a serial console. So there was basically no way to change the kernel arguments on first boot. You would have to like log into the running system, then change the kernel arguments, and then reboot. With Ignition, we run early enough in the RAMFS that we can detect that when there are kernel arguments, and then reboot and apply those kernel arguments before we actually get into the real root. We made /boot read only. Manually modifying /boot is discouraged. It's really easy to make mistakes and find yourself in a really precarious situation. And it's really just it also has the advantage of like protecting people from making doing malicious things on your system. The way we encourage users to modify boot is actually with RPM OS tree. There's a RPM OS tree KR command, and if you want to change the boot order, you can use RPM OS tree rollback, deploy, or update. We also added support for advanced root reprovisioning. Here's a couple examples of 2 things we added. This is just LUKS encryption for your root partition. And this is RAID support. So you can do all this now through Ignition on the first boot. I'll hand off to Dusty.
Thanks, Mike. Okay, so Mike kind of went over what happened last year. We decided to include that just because we thought some of those things were pretty cool. But let's talk about what's been going on this year in Fedora CoreOS, what we've been up to. So first off, we're always adding new platforms and new architectures, or at least trying to. So we added ARch64 support, including AWS images. So if you want to grab some of those Graviton instances and run Fedora CoreOS, you can do it. We also added S390x support, and if you are like me, you'd be surprised to know that you can actually launch an S390x instance in the cloud. So yeah, that actually made it accessible for the first time. to me anyway. We also added support for Nutanix. So that's a different platform that people were asking us for that we added support for. And then one thing that's interesting is we also became the base for Podman Machine. So Podman Machine is kind of a way to get up and running with a little container development environment on a platform that isn't Linux. I think you can do it on Linux too, but if you're on Linux, you might as well run Podman directly. We'll take questions at the end. So Fedora CoreOS was a good small like system that the Podman folks decided to use because it includes Podman to run on top of to create that VM to use for the development environment. So like if you're on an M1 Mac and you run Podman Machine, you're running AR64 Fedora CoreOS underneath, which is kind of cool. So we added DNF count me support. So if you've ever been to a talk by Matthew Miller and he goes through all of those different slides, yes, he's in the back. He goes through all those different slides and talks about numbers and how many people are on Fedora 33 and 32 and all that stuff. We were never included in any of those numbers, primarily because OS tree-based systems don't hit Yum repositories. We delivered via an OS tree repository typically. So we wouldn't necessarily be counted in that information. So we decided to rectify that. So we have a small systemd unit that runs periodically and checks in the same way that systems that do DNF updates check in. But like, you know, what have we gotten out of those statistics? So here is about the last 5 months of information that we have for Fedora CoreOS nodes kind of checking in. And if you see, we've gone from somewhere around 17,000 nodes in April of this year to about 33,000 nodes. And I broke this graph down based on systems that have been around for longer than a week and systems that have been around for less than a week. So maybe CI systems and or cloud systems that spin up, do a job, and then spin down, which is nice in the cloud. If you don't need it anymore, don't pay for it. So yeah, so it's about a half and half distribution between nodes that are just transient, less than 1 week, and nodes that are around for a long time. Some other information that we've got out of those count me stats, we can kind of see that 2/3 of the nodes that exist today, or at least that have checked in the past week, are on Fedora 36. That's a good indicator that a lot of people are leaving automatic updates enabled, which is what we want them to do. We have one person with a node on Fedora 32. If you if you are that person, please update your node. So we have a few that are still on Fedora 34, and then looks like about, maybe 30% or so still on Fedora 35 that need to also update. As far as architecture breakdown, we just recently added S390x, and obviously we probably won't have a huge base there either. But between AR64, which looks like it's probably about, 20%, maybe between 15 and 20 or something, and x86-64, that pretty much takes the bulk of it. For AR64, obviously we have people using Podman Machine on like the M1 Macs. We also have Raspberry Pi support, and then there's AWS and other clouds that have AR64 instances now. So we probably should see that grow. Another thing since the last year, so one thing we used to not do very well in Fedora CoreOS is follow some of like the Fedora change proposal process. We were kind of just getting off the ground for a long time. So one thing that we missed actually was when Fedora, I think in 32, switched over to NF tables as the backend for IP tables. We actually missed that because the way it was implemented was using alternatives, and the way alternatives works doesn't really work very well with RPM OS tree systems. We actually have a FAQ entry for that at the bottom there, but we just happened to miss it, and somebody reported an issue one day, and we're like, hey, why are we different than the rest of Fedora on this? We have a test for that now. But yeah, so we had to like kind of figure out, okay, we're in this situation. How do we manage to migrate our nodes that exist to what the rest of Fedora is, so we don't have a delta there, right? We want to be as much like the rest of Fedora as we can in most ways, so that we're not a snowflake. Another thing that Colin and team have been working on in the background is basically taking OS tree commits and putting them in container images. Why is this useful? So if you happen to be, in an offline or disconnected environment and you're trying to mirror all this infrastructure into that environment so you can keep your nodes up to date, you probably already have a container registry because you're running containers. Otherwise, you wouldn't be running Fedora CoreOS most likely. And to deliver OS updates, you would also have to have an OS tree repository, which is just served over HTTP. So it's not a huge barrier to entry, but it is something else that you have to do. So we started looking at like, how do we actually take an OS tree commit and put it in a container image so you can put it in a registry and kind of mirror it around that way. And I'll talk a little bit more about why this is useful here in a minute. We also started building and testing against the rawhide stream. So this really helps us find and fix issues before they ever even get close to our production next testing and stable streams. We found a lot of issues since we implemented this. It also means that every time we put out a new version of or a new build happens on the rawhide stream, all of those tests pass. If something fails, we find like the culprit, say it's a new RPM that came in, and we'll actually pin on the older version of that RPM while it gets fixed. So we can then respin the build with the pinned RPM and see if anything else is broken. Because one thing about rawhide is a lot of times it might take, like if the pungy rawhide compose is broken, more things that are broken keep building up and you don't actually know it because there was no compose to test, right? So like this is a way that we can actually say, okay, we know this is broken, pin on that, and then try it again, right? And we can find other things that are broken at the same time. And we've also been doing a lot of boring stuff. So we've made a lot of investments in our automated testing and our automated builds, so our release engineering processes. All of this stuff allows us to be more efficient and to do more things like adding new platforms and architectures. Because without that, we're not able to do the other stuff. So there's a lot that's been going on behind the scenes that users don't necessarily see. Okay, so what's coming soon? So I mentioned some things about Fedora in there. Basically, we're trying to become a top-level Fedora edition and hoping that's going to happen for Fedora 37. We've done a lot of hard work to get to this point. So we've done a lot of work to get closer to like when a Fedora GA release happens, switching Fedora CoreOS nodes over to that latest version of Fedora GA. A long time ago, or when we first started out, we would wait a lot longer because we do automatically update nodes. And it's kind of scary. It's like, okay, Fedora 37 just came out. Is everybody going to go now? That can be scary. But at this point, we've done a lot of investing in our automated testing, our CI. We also run test days. We also have multiple streams that people test out that Mike mentioned earlier. So we're starting to get to a point where we have a lot more confidence. So now, when Fedora 37 goes beta, our next stream will get switched to Fedora 37. When it goes GA, our testing stream will get switched to Fedora 37. And then 2 weeks after GA, hopefully, if everybody smiles on us, our stable stream will switch over to Fedora 37 too. So we've done a lot of work to get a closer proximity to Fedora releases, so we are seen as more like related to Fedora and not just a one-off. We've also been working a lot closer with Fedora QA to kind of like set some release criteria and kind of be involved in the go no-go meetings for Fedora major releases. We've been participating more in the Fedora changes process. So reviewing those changes as they come in and also proposing new ones. I think we had 3 that were proposed for this last cycle that actually came from our group or a collaboration between our group and other groups. And then also just continuing to do what we do best, which is deliver Fedora CoreOS and try to be as stable as possible. We're also working on more enablement, more platforms. So Azure and GCP have ARM instances now that we want to kind of put out images for. Azure community galleries is a thing that exists, which allows us to create an image in Azure and share it with other people. Previously, we weren't really able to do that unless you had like a commercial relationship with Microsoft to be in their marketplace. We're adding PowerPC support. That should be in the next round of releases that happens. We're adding support for KubeVirt, which is kind of like launching a VM in Kubernetes or OpenShift. and then secure execution support for S390x if you like mainframes. Okay, the big one, Coreos Layering, something we've been calling Coreos Layering and or OS tree native containers. So as I mentioned earlier, Fedora CoreOS or OS trees in general have typically been served from an OS tree repository. But now we have the ability to actually ship that as a container. So now it's in a container registry and it's shipped up like a container. Like, can I treat it as a container? Well, we've actually been working to get to a point where you can at least treat it, you know, and derive from it as a container. I don't know if you necessarily want to run it as your base for your application, but at least as far as treating it like an image that you can derive from, yes. And I'll show you a little bit more about that here. So, okay. So we have a container in a container registry. This is a Docker file and or a container file, depending on what you want to call it. So we derive from an image in a container registry. This example basically creates a Yum repository file, installs a package, enables a service, and then commits the container. So in this case, it's Tailscale. So it basically grabs the Tailscale repo, does an RPM OS tree install of Tailscale, and then systemctl enables Tailscale, and then commits that container. So if we take this Docker file and we run a build of that container image, and we push that container image to a registry, you can then take your systems and rebase to it. So you can actually reference the container in the container registry, rebase to it, and then any updates to that container image in that container registry will, you know, if you RPM up OS tree upgrade in the future, it'll essentially look at that. So this is really useful. We put it in the coming soon section because there's a lot of little details that still need to be worked out. One of the benefits of Fedora CoreOS is we have an update graph, which means that, you know, if we identify that an update was actually bad after the fact, we can actually remove that from consideration from our update server that tells nodes what to update to. Or we can, you know, basically send people through barriers. So for example, if we do some sort of migration where we're switching you from, I don't know, IP tables NFT or, you know, the old legacy IP tables to IP tables NFT, we can essentially make you take a particular update path. So we can say, okay, update to this version first, which we know has a script that'll run some migration for you, and then update to that version later, right? With this stuff, all of that kind of goes away because now it's just like following a container in a container registry, right? So we kind of need to figure out some of that stuff before we really tell a lot of people to use this. But it's there today. You can already do these things, but you might lose some of like those extra features as a result. Yeah. So why would you want to do something like this though? Like one example is like what that example was, add a new RPM. You could take that container and push it to like a staging container registry location and run CI tests against that, like in your own infrastructure, and then say, okay, that was good. Then push it to prod. Right now, you have two options if you want to do something similar. You could build your own Fedora CoreOS, which is a little more heavyweight. It's not too bad. Or you can just client-side package layer all that stuff, right? Which, you know, you're not necessarily testing that before you ship it out to all your nodes, right? They're just individually all doing that. You can also package up like configuration, right? If you happen to want your node to have different crypto policies or something like that, you can do all of that here instead of doing it on the node itself, which has some benefits. Okay, let's take some questions. You.
Yes, I am wondering if I'm wondering if any other new architectures are being added. For example, RISC-V.
So right now, Fedora itself doesn't support RISC-V, and I feel like, or part of the reason for that is there's not really like a server like equivalent RISC-V that you can put in a rack and has some sort of out-of-band management, right? Because Fedora's infrastructure is in a data center without people there to like push a button to turn it on and stuff like that. So basically, I think what's blocking RISC-V and Fedora is just having proper server-like hardware that can be used. And then once we get that, we'll probably get some donations of that hardware, and we can actually add it. But yeah, there is like a shadow version of people working on RISC-V support, but it's not official, and we can't do anything unless it's official. Dan?
How do you get rid of packages that are not used by many people going forward?
Dan's heckling me. Yeah. So in that layering example that I just mentioned, where you add a package, you can also remove a package the same way. So like in the future, if Podman wanted to create their own Podman machine version of Fedora CoreOS, like to get rid of the bits, I don't know if the resulting. I mean, it would just drop out of our package list, right? If it's no longer in Fedora anymore, then it would become something that just got removed in a particular release of. We could always have a discussion about it, right? Dan wants to get rid of Moby engine in Fedora CoreOS. Any other questions? I had one back there. Can you repeat the question? Sorry, did anybody hear that better? So is there any crash dump telemetry? I don't think so. I think Fedora has like a server set up where like crashes will send like data back to a server, so we kind of can analyze if there's like a common pattern. But I don't think our systems do any of that. Yeah, I don't think any of the infrastructure for that is installed by default. I think I had you right here.
So it's you guys saying Fedora CoreOS. Is there a non-Fedora flavor of CoreOS, or is it pretty much understandable that if it's a CoreOS, it's Fedora? And just a twist to that question is, for a downstream like an OpenShift distribution, would you have a CentOS CoreOS in it?
So the analog to Fedora CoreOS within Red Hat is something called RHEL CoreOS, which a lot of people just abbreviate as RH CoreOS. There's no productized version of specifically that because it is part of OpenShift. So the only way to consume that is to basically consume OpenShift. There is some effort within the OKD, the upstream OpenShift community, to have like a CentOS stream-based CoreOS, but that's kind of like just getting off the ground. So right now, yeah, we keep Fedora in front of Fedora CoreOS because that's just the most explicit way, and obviously it allows for there to be other options in the future too.
When you showed adding via a container file, can I put a jar or any type of file in it, and OS3 will handle it? Or does that have to be RPM?
Possibly. So you'd also have to install Java, right?
Right. No, but any type, I could put any blob, any type of file in.
Yes, we'd obviously prefer you not to necessarily go crazy with it. Because it makes it less supportable, right? So like if you do a bunch of stuff, some of that could rely on things in the host. One good example for that workflow is actually something like kernel modules, right? Like if you happen to have a kernel module that's not in the kernel itself, obviously it's an external module, you can now derive from Fedora CoreOS, check what version of the kernel is in this Fedora CoreOS, build your module, install it to the right place, and commit the container, right? That's an example where you can't really do that in a container very easily. Like there's some examples where people do it, but it's kind of janky. I've done it myself. But like as far as like installing a Java application,
Yeah, that was just
yeah. Well, like you can do that, but like it's also one of those things where like you if you break it, you get both pieces, right? You can't really come to us and be like, hey, I installed Java. And yeah. Anybody else here? Yep.
I use Oracle Cloud. Does CoreOS have instances? Does CoreOS have an ability to make a cloud virtual appliance on Oracle Cloud?
In other words, do we support Oracle Cloud? We create an image for Oracle Cloud. We don't have one right now. I think there is an open issue for requesting that. And I think there is some benefit to doing that because I think they have a free tier that actually has ARM instances and stuff like that, which could be interesting to add.
Their free tier is extremely generous compared to most products that they run.
Yeah.
So it's very attractive for that purpose.
Yeah. So we're not opposed, and we encourage contributions in that area too. Okay. Thank you, everybody.